Our first speaker, Tatiana Ivleva, can have her career and oeuvre defined by one word: mobility. Both personally, in her movements from Moscow to Leiden to Munich, back to Leiden, to Berlin, and now to the UK, where she is a Marie Curie Research Fellow, and in her work, which is focused on the movement of Britons out of their province across the continent through small finds. Today, she'll be speaking to us about to be a global glass bangle or not to be, and dealing with the issues of taxonomy that are both essential to our field, but also, as Astrid started us off with, deeply problematic in themselves. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tatiana Ivleva.
Thank you, Matthew, very much for that introduction. Just a couple of the announcements. Because I move a lot, travel a lot, I do get sometimes I'm very sick, so I got a cold right now. My voice is, as I can hear it, is kind of like dying slowly and painfully. I've got my drugs, I've got my hot tea, although I won't blame anyone who will fall asleep when my voice will go like that. So just try not to snore. There was also a little bit of change in the title from to be glass bangle or not to be to be global glass bangle, and the reason for that I think you will all learn after 30 minutes of listening to me. My presentation today concerns a rather peculiar artifact used by the inhabitants of Britain in Roman period. This artifact is glass bangle, a rigid ring-shaped adornment made of colored glass. These artifacts are commonly assumed to fulfill the role of women's adornments and mostly referred to as bangles in Anglo-Saxon literature to differentiate them from the bracelet, which indicates the loose, flexible jewelry mostly made out of metal. Romano-British glass bangles are usually divided into 3 types. So type 1 has a core of translucent blue glass, and it is covered with obliquely laid bands of opaque yellow and opaque red. It is rather thick type. There are other 2 types, type 2 and type 3. They're very light types, and the main difference between them is that type 2 has twisted cords in cobalt blue and opaque white, which are laid in different positions within the glass body of the bangle. For instance, this one is called a herringbone pattern. And type 3, to differentiate it from type 2, made in a variety of colors, while type 2 is mostly blue glass. Type 3 is made sometimes out of opaque white, opaque yellow, and different types of colored glass. But all of these have inlaid trails in opaque white, or sometimes in different colors, or sometimes these trails are laid in so-called pot hook shapes. And this is just an image for you to see how these artifacts look in the real life. So type 1, type 2, and type 3. We mostly have fragments of them of about 20 to 30 millimeters, and we rarely have them found complete. I think there are at least 5 to 6 complete bracelets known from whole of Roman Britain. These items are found in Britain around Claudian Neronian time in the south. Then they spread farther north, where they really boom. The majority of them have come from Yorkshire, northeast of Britain, line of Hadrian's Wall, and the southeast of Scotland. So Edinburgh is somewhere here, just to give you the position. So what I've just said right now, it's actually a textbook description of glass bangles in Roman period Britain. This description is usually what we know about the emergence, development, typology, and the use of these artifacts. Glass bangles have been primarily studied by glass specialists and are seen as insignificant bylines in the study of Romano-British material culture. I really do wonder how many of you knew about these artifacts before my presentation. Okay, it's quite all right. But actually, I didn't know about them myself when people in Newcastle said to me, like, oh, we have this wonderful project, and if you can get funds for that, please do. And I was like, okay, what's this project about? They was like, glass bangles. I said, yes, bring it on, fine. And then I went immediately to Google, because I didn't know what I agreed to do for the next 2 years of my life. So in my work and in my presentation today, I would like actually to argue that these artifacts were part of grand narrative during late Iron Age to Roman period transition in Britain and in the first 2 centuries CE. This textbook description has many issues, and unfortunately I don't have time to go into each of them into the detail. My research project aims to dismantle most of them, but today I will focus on one issue. It's the emergence of glass bangles in south of Britain during Claudio-Neronian time. And just let us for a minute forget about glass bangles. Matthew already introduced me as a very mobile person, and then organizing committee, thank you for that, then invited me to Toronto. The idea was that my cultural background would be an ideal avenue to explore one of the aims of this symposium, so how our contemporary political geography and upbringing, color or perception, and understanding of Roman Empire, its people, and its artifacts. So, as Matthew already said, I did my BA in Russia on the subject connected to Roman Britain. My MA and my PhD were in the Netherlands, in University of Leiden, on the subject of human and object mobility in Roman Empire, and I'm currently a postdoc in Newcastle University in UK. So when I started researching the emergence of glass bangles, I was relatively happy with the following explanation. And let's just, for the sake of the symposium aims, call it a Russian perspective, with the caveat of what we think we know about Russian archaeology or Russian perspective on material culture is also very much lopsided. The narrative on the appearance of glass bangles in British scholarly literature that did not change since 1980s is as follows. The emergence is connected to the 43 CE Claudian annexation of Britain, as the earliest evidence for the production of glass bangles comes from the south of Britain in the aftermath of Roman invasion. What has provided some credibility to this view are the following 2 points. The first is the knowledge that around mid-1st century CE, Britain has no history of glass bracelet production, in contrast to the European continent, where seamless glass bangles were produced and used for about 3 centuries within the territories which were inhabited by the Celts. They appear in the middle of the 3rd century BC in southern Germany, and they start to be relatively massively produced in the following centuries. And by the late 2nd century CE, early 3rd century BC, early 3rd century BC, they're found all across the northwest European mainland. But by the Augustan period, glass bangles fell out of favor on the continent. They do, however, rather interestingly reappear in the mid-1st century CE Britain, where they flourish in the 2nd century, but again fell out of favor in the late 2nd century CE. The second point, why bangles arrive in Britain after 43 CE, is the dating evidence. The earliest bangles in the southern Britain are made of translucent glass in various colors, with applied bichrome cords consisting of twisted rods in opaque white and cobalt blue. This is type 2 in the accepted typology. The majority of them are found in Gloucestershire, in Bristol Channel area and southeast of Wales, on the sites with known or suspected Roman military occupation. 2 glass bangles fragments were found in Fishbourne, which is here, which it is usually assumed to be an early Roman military supply base, built a couple of years after Roman invasion, and in the subsequent periods turned into the palace. These 2 fragments were found in the layer called Phase 1, and which has been dated to pre-75 CE. Another fragment was found outside of Britain, but in the same, looking like this. It was found in the Netherlands on the site of the auxiliary Roman fortress Valkenburg, and in the layers dated to 4769 CE. So these 3 artifacts, so 2 from Fishbourne, 1 from Valkenburg, provided evidence for the terminus ante quem glass bangles in Britain came into the existence. So after 43 CE, during late Claudian-Neronian period. The design of British bangles themselves are rather different from the continental ones. So here are some photos to show you how the continental ones and British look like for comparison. Continental glass bangles, their design was usually made by tweaking a hot glass into various shapes. So for instance, this one is tweaked into knots. This is just incised, and this one. Sometimes these incised patterns, they're decorated with applied opaque yellow or opaque white zigzag patterns. And the British ones, you know, they only used cords or applied opaque white spot hook decorations. I actually, I hope you can hear me, I brought some of them for you today, just to see, just take into account that the small ones, these are British designs, although they're small, but it doesn't mean that they were that small, it's just the way my craftsmen can make them. So just if you want to spread, look at them, or what do you prefer, I can put it on the table and then during the break you look at them. I also have continental ones, the big ones. So just for you to, so that, you know, the British ones actually would look like that. That would be their size. But unfortunately, I can't make them yet on this size. All right. The design. The hypothesis was put forward that this cord decoration on British, from un-British glass bangles of type 2 was most likely a British invention based on the meandering cable, so that's meandering cable, which was used to decorate a particular type of British indigenous bead. These beads have a focus of distribution in southwest of Britain, and as you can see, it's also notable concentration in Somerset, Bristol Channel area, and Gloucestershire, which are actually the exact same areas where the majority of these pre- and early Flavian type 2 glass bangles came from. So the current traditional view is that the bangles first appeared around Bristol Channel area in Gloucestershire, so it's their core area, and then they spread outwards to the southern coastal regions in Britain, such as Sussex and East Anglia. So to summarize the traditional view, after Brigitte Hofmann, she said, quote, "Within a decade of Roman conquest, Britain saw a newly created group of glass jewelry beginning to be adopted by the provincial garrison that combined Roman raw materials with native British Iron Age expertise and decorative elements," end of quote. This view that glass bangles started their life after 43 CE, in my view, supports the now outdated Roman versus native interpretive framework. It sees artifacts as simple representations of cultural emulations of two opposing dichotomies, Roman and British. It assumes an approach that everything that was new in mid-first century CE Britain came into being as a result of either change brought by the Roman imperial expansion and establishment of new supply work, or resistance by good native Britons that expressed their resistance through the work of art. These bangles are seen in the light of their representational value as innovative trappings and as carriers of Romanesque, because they were invented then alien Roman material, raw glass, was supplied for the invading army networks. This view emanates from the discussion the multivalent social context of the societies in which glass bangles came into existence. And what I would like to do is to put bangles back into the context and discuss their emergence in the line with the theoretical framework I came to appreciate when studying and working in the Netherlands and in the UK. By putting the bangles into the context, we will see that their emergence was very much part of the late Iron Age to Roman period transition, rather than one-off event starting after the Claudian invasion in 43 CE as conventionally described. The pre-Roman late Iron Age Britain is usually characterized as a time when various cultural aspects were either directly ascended or borrowed from across the Channel or North Sea. Emergence of new cremation burial rites and new dining habits, new ways of bodily adornment and clothes fastening are seen as a result of long-held and long-established links with the continent. These cross-channel relations had great regional variations, pointing to late Iron Age society of southern Britain exercising individual and communal choices of what to appropriate or adapt or recreate or select from a widely dispersed repertoire of continental trappings. Caution is also exercised in seeing all the above changes as externally driven. External factors enhanced various developments in most spheres of southern British society, but most scholars agree that these developments were already under their way, either in the middle or in the earliest decades of late Iron Age period. So why should we see the emergence of the Type II glass bangles as part of these developments in southern Britain at this time? Here is why. The occurrence of two glass bangles in the earliest layers in Fishbourne, dated to 4375 CE, has provided scholars to terminus antiquem glass bangles came into the existence. Yet, the earliest phases of Fishbourne have been recently reinterpreted. Various unambiguous fetiches and artifacts found at various sites in and across the site provided cumulative evidence for the occupation of Fishbourne a generation earlier than 43 CE. Fishbourne has most likely Augustan or Tiberian foundations. This reinterpretation of the dating of the site suggests that one cannot be entirely sure that the bangles found in phase 1 are of Claudian or later date as is commonly assumed. If the phasing of the site should be moved to the earlier dates, the evidence for the start of Type II bangles in south of Britain can be freed from the straitjacket of 43 CE. Fishbourne early phases are just the beginnings in my reinterpretation of the emergence of glass bangles in south of Britain. Other is the glass availability in pre-43 CE Britain. We know that what we call Roman find types, such as military metalwork and pottery, were available in Britain, in southern Britain, in pre-conquest period. In this light, it would not be a fair point to assume that glass, which is also sometimes considered to be a typical Roman artifact, arrived to Britain after 43 CE and only after that point. Fine glass ware, such as this gold band glass mosaic vessel and other glass artifacts, which are commonly dated to the earlier 1st century CE, were also found in Fishburne in their earliest Augustan and Tiberian layers. Moreover, Julian Henderson research indicated that southern Britain has at least two glass working sites. I don't see what I'm pointing at. So, okay, Mere villages in the Somerset and Hengsterbury Head in Dorset. And Mere villages in particular are very famous in late Iron Age and in early periods actually for these glass beads, which has a very intricate opaque yellow meandering decoration. Up to now, we still don't know where does the raw glass for these objects comes from. Remember, 10 minutes ago, I said that bangles in Britain did not appear out of nowhere. We have continental late Iron Age glass bracelets. But the problem is that British glass bangles were always seen in isolation from their continental counterparts. They were usually assumed as these old glass artifacts that have no predecessors. This is actually not true. My close inspection of around 400 glass bangles fragments found across various sites in UK and in the south of Britain in particular suggests that first, British and continental glass bangles were manufactured using the same technique, and second, the decorative elements on the earliest southern glass bangles were adapted from the designs of continental beads. Experimental work on the continental glass bangles by my colleague in Sorbonne in Paris in France, Joël Roland, had shown that continental ones were produced by a winding technique on 2 iron rods. So first, the hot blob of glass was winded around the first iron rod. Then the second iron rod was inserted into the opening, and by careful manipulation and stretching and constant rotation of the first rod, a more or less rounded glass object is created. And this technique is very similar to the production of glass bangles, which is still done in Nigeria and in Nepal. This technique leaves visible traces in the body of bangles and on its surfaces. I don't see what I'm pointing. Okay, gas or air bubbles trapped inside the body of glass bangles because the glass was not sufficiently fused. A second feature is this so-called internal papery folds. Possibly they were made when individually gathered chunks of glass were winded around an iron rod. And also on relatively many bangles, on the inner surfaces of them, one can observe these flakes of iron, which is fused to the surface, and this iron is right now corroded. And these flakes are most likely scales forming on the surface of the hot iron tool rod, which fused with the softened surface of hot glass mass. And all of these features occur as on the continental, as on the British fragments. I think that manufacturing technique was not the only one borrowed from the continent. Court decoration was another, in contrast to the long-held opinion that court decoration on Type 2 bangles in south of Britain is a native British phenomenon. Such cords are also present on some of the late Iron Age glass beads. These beads, they usually have a core of purple or blue-colored glass onto which an extremely thick cords twisted in cobalt blue and opaque white are applied. The ways the cords are made on beads or Type 2 glass bangles are of course different, the thickness is different, but I think the idea was shared. And let us again forget about glass bangles for a minute. When in my PhD I wrote the following phrase, "Objects move with humans," my then colleague Michael John Verschlaus commented with "no" many exclamation marks. His "no" meant to imply that the objects were not necessarily accompanied by their manufacturers or by their users when they travel. Rather, it is an idea or a concept of an object that moved through the shared networks of interaction and connectivity. A concept that was part of what he calls a coiner of shared cultural symbols. This shared cultural concept was known across various areas of the known ancient world, or oikumena, but had also evolved independently from its original cultural background when it's found its way to another cultural sphere. Through movement and mobility within the networks and context, the concept developed, adapted, mutated. When it was eventually realized as a material object, it may have been locally contextualized, for instance, visually adapted to fit the circumstances. A few of the innovations in late Iron Age Britain were derived from context with the late Iron Age continental Europe. But, quoting Martin Pitts from 2008 article, these innovations were not blanket acceptance of imported practices. All of them happened with particular British sheen and were regionally dependent. Rather than being a simple adoption of the elements, it was localized selection and customization of shared cultural concepts to fit the regional circumstances. The development of bangles and their specific design suggest that they were not copies or antecedents of continental glass bracelets or bead styles. Rather, their technical and visual aspects were such local recontextualization of the shared cultural concept of a bracelet or a bangle. It was a reinterpretation based on a careful interplay of selective borrowing of continental bracelets and beads' technical and visual aspects to fit the local consumer tastes. Bangles are actually not alone. The analysis by a wide range of scholars on items associated with the body, such as grooming artifacts, toilet instruments, dress adornments, and mirrors, points to the changing attitudes towards body and display in this transitional period. Many of these artifacts have continental predecessors, but as glass bangles, they were not copies, but were also selectively adapted and reinvented from the continental repertoire. Fairy folk glass bangles in Britain were the products of their time, born out of the discourses of various elements in interconnected southern Britain and European Gallic and Roman mainland. The current approaches see changes in the type of artifacts used in the pre-Roman late Iron Age transitional period in Britain as a result of the construction of new social relations and reconfiguration of identities of the population that were rather proactive and vocal in their choices. And again, Martin Pitts suggests to see this, quote, complex worldview in which cultural change could be multidirectional and differently negotiated in individual localities as part of globalizing processes in late Iron Age to Roman period transition. I think Martin will share more on that later today. I hope I will not stealing his thunder, but his research on various imported vessels in Southwest Britain draws an image of integrated societies where goods and people moved through this globalizing network of cross-channel links. These global networks allowed the Southern Britain became part of a wider continental culture, but at the same time choose from a range of divergent continental trappings, something to fit own regional cultural trajectories. I realized that at this point I possibly said too much, too long, and possibly some of you already suffer from the overload of information. Maybe there is confusion some way or another, but I'm going to finish my presentation right now, and just to give you a quick following summary. First of all, I believe that we can no longer see the development of British glass Bengals as part of this native Roman dichotomy, but I think I don't need to persuade any of you with that. And second, that I hope that to have shown that we cannot put the emergence of particular artifacts of material culture to particular periods and dates. So we cannot put a demarcating line for glass Bengals development at 43 CE. I believe that Bengal's genesis must be placed into the wider context of material culture development, societal and political changes in the late Iron Age to Roman period transition. And by putting them into the context of this multivalent period, I think we should consider them as part of this globalized phenomena. But I'm rather bit conscious in calling them global glass Bengals because there is, of course, the danger of inventing just another label, as Astrid already pointed in her presentation. But I do think that considering them within this globalizing framework, it allows us also to go beyond ethnic labeling of these artifacts. Because are these objects Celtic? Are they subject to Celtic art? Are they Roman? Are they British? Are they Romano-British? Are they hybrids? Etc. I don't think they are neither. But any feedback is always welcome. So thank you for your attention. Well, first of all, I think Martin would be talking about pottery later on. Research by Hella Eckhart in Reading University in UK, she did analysis of these nail cleaners or these toilet sets. In particular, she found out that nail cleaners on the continents, they also die out in the Augustan period. But in Britain, this particular period, there is a boom in nail cleaners and in manufacture. So there is one thing. Another thing is particular types of also decorative objects have some continental or some also classical predecessors. There are so-called Winchester torques. They're found in the court in Winchester in the south of Britain. And these torques, that it clearly shows that they were made using a classical expertise in how to twist golden wires. But the torques are very much late Iron Age, or if you want to call it Celtic, part of type of culture. But the way they appear, the way they look like, it has no predecessors on the continent as in Britain. But it's like a combination of three various elements within one object. There are also other types of stuff that you can dig in and look at. And the problem is that we always, when discussing this transitional period, majority of their work is focused on metalwork. And there is this wonderful book, Technologies of Enchantments, 2010, Chris Gosden et al. I forgot all the other people. And they only look at metalwork. Although when I put my distribution map of glass Bengals, parallel to the distribution of metalwork, how it moves from south of Britain into the north, it's a 100% match. Yeah, so they're part of this sphere. They're arriving and they're being made in the spirit, and this is why we have them. The other thing is that I know there's too much to say, but these ones, type 1, this is actually predominantly Scottish. They don't cross line at all. And they're so much different from the other two. I mean, they're actually using different manufacturing techniques to produce these ones. There are some similarities as well. But these ones, you shouldn't be looking at within the same type of objects. And this one, they start to be arriving, they're found mostly in
of my position as moderator to ask a question, pushing you beyond the moment of adoption and this global or koine self-fashioning into the later period. Does the sort of picture of decline on the continent and uptake in Britain as two peaks still work? And if so, it strikes me that what we seem to have, both in my research in North Africa and here, are these rare moments of koine and globalism that punctuate a highly regionalized pattern of fashioning and practice and behavior.
Yeah, well, when I showed this map for the first time, my colleague in Haynes, he hated it, and he said, that looks like Twin Peaks. So when you said peaks, he told me not to use it, but as being very cocky and postdoc, I said, no, I will. But of course, there are many issues with this map as well. Possibly the level of British artifacts doesn't reach the same level in terms of on the continent. There is also signs of regionality within the continental ones as well. I will place a little bit with the idea because the name of my project is called Global Glass. Global Glass Adornments Event Horizon. And as we all know, when we write a grant proposal, we try to put, very nice and funny words into the title. And Kevin Green at the Newcastle University, Martin would know, he actually said, don't call them global. He hated it. And I gave him a very lousy answer why I call it Global Glass. So I'm trying to defend the name of my project into that sense. And I will try to play with the idea of looking at this class development, starting from the continent, from the 3rd century BC, going into their 4th century CE and seeing how does it develops. And I was thinking like whether we can call all of this as a global glass bangles because they're very much part of Celtic inhabited territory. They do come into Italy, there is not so much in Spain, and they really do concentrate on this really line of the inhabited world. There are a lot of regional patterning within this. As you said yesterday, someone was 50% local, what 50% global, and 100% regional, which I thought was actually lovely because this is what we have. There is a lot of global part as an object. It is known. We do know there are glass bangles as such. We have them in local areas, there are different types of designs. There is chronological difference as well. There are changes in terms of how they're decorated. But they're very much part of particular areas where they're produced. So I will play with this idea, also for the sake just of defending the title that I stupidly chose when I was pregnant. But I became to really recently appreciative of what Martin is doing and what Michael John Waschlaus is doing in their book and in their discussion. And I'm really interested to know what Martin thinks about that. He can say this complete nonsense, because I know that he's very much conscious of how we're using idea of globalization because it's just a very, it's a buzzword, We're not thinking of, applying them to really to understand what's going on. And the title of my proposal, it's actually using a buzzword, but I need to understand in terms of whether we can. And for south of Britain, it's so interesting to see that it is part of this either interconnected or part of this globalist network of people moving. Although I've heard recently someone said, there's a lot of interconnectivity and it's wonderful. And other person said, yes, there's so much research on connectivity, but it's only showed that there are connections, but nothing else, So, and I think that in terms of globalization, it allows us to move beyond so many issues that we are dealing as well. As I said, ethnic identification, connectivity, interconnectedness, and such things. But I might be, of course, wrong, and maybe 5 years from now on when I publish my book, it won't be called Global Glass, but please buy my book, something like that, and I will use another buzzword in here. But I'm not going to use, Romano-British glass bangles again, like Romanization 2.0, something, but no. Okay.